I'm Janice McWilliams. I have a couple of different roles in my professional life. I work with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and I work in the area of staff training and spiritual formation. I also am in private practice as a therapist where I see a lot of couples, and occasionally I get to preach here, and often about really awkward things. Now, I've also been married for 27 years to Dan, and in those years, we've had our periods of our marriage being at real highs and also at real lows. One of those times was when we were both team leaders with the fellowship at UC Davis, and we had a bunch of recent college graduates who were interns on our team at that time. And Dan and I were just struggling and really had some stuck patterns in how we were trying to work together and be married at the same time. And at this time, this group of young interns was planning a road trip together to go look at another campus as a possible place to plant an InterVarsity chapter. And they all had crushes on each other, and they're all single, and they're flirting, and they've got all this kind of sexual chemistry charging all around, and they were packing up the van and leaving, and as they were leaving, I just realized, I am so jealous of that. Because I felt old and boring, and like I was having some difficulty feeling like my marriage was that electric or exciting. Now, the irony for that to me is that happened when I was 29. But we processed through that. We got help, and we worked on things, and we didn't stay stuck. But friends, marriage can be a place where we find ourselves in a hot mess very often. As I've worked in the area of couples counseling, I've just realized, wow, there's so much brokenness in these relationships. And that's no different in the church. And so we have experienced being hot messes, and certainly in the early church, they experienced it too. Now, this series that we're looking at is in 1 Corinthians. So Paul is the writer of this letter that is written to the young church in Corinth, and those people, those new believers, have a lot of questions. Now, there's also a lot of sexual immorality in the church, and he addresses that earlier in the book. But as he comes to chapter 7, which is where we are today, he's addressing some particular questions that are coming up. You see, people were becoming Christians, and there was a movement of people in the society around them that believed that spirituality and sexuality should be completely separate. And so when people came to faith in Jesus, they were sort of trying on adopting this philosophy. And so they're asking Paul, isn't it better if once you become a Christian, if you stop having any kind of sexual relationship? And even, are we supposed to get divorced? And so Paul is addressing this, and he addresses it in 4 ways in this chapter. So I'm going to summarize that, and then we'll circle back and look more closely at one of the points he makes. First of all, as he says, to those of you who are married, no, don't stop having a sexual relationship. Number 2, he says, to the single people out there, though, stay single. It's preferred in many ways to be single. He says, be like I am, be single. Now, let me just pause on this point, because this would have been a very radical message at the time. People struggled with feeling like they had a sense of identity, as particularly women, if they weren't married. And so what Paul is saying is he takes that role of singlehood and he elevates it to a place that I think that is astounding in the first century. You know, for us as well, elevating that sense of what does it mean to be single, and can we honor and value that, becomes very important in our church too. Now, the third thing he says is no, don't get divorced, stay married. And then finally, he addresses the possibility of any of you who have become believers, if you're married to somebody who doesn't believe, go ahead and stay married. It might be really good for the unbelieving spouse. It might be good for the children. But if they want to leave you, let them. So that's the summary. Now, the first section is where I want to spend most of our time today, because it's where Paul gives most of his detail and attention. So we're looking in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we're going to look at the first 5 verses. He says this, now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relationships with a woman. But, and that's the quote that they were asking him about, isn't it good that we stop having this sexual relationship? And so he says this, but since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to the wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body. And now let me pause here. This would probably be something that most of those readers expected to hear in the first century, that the woman doesn't have authority over her own body. But then look what he adds. But yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to the wife. Now here's where Paul goes amazingly radical. He is saying something that is completely different. Not only does the wife yield her body to the husband, but the husband in the same way yields the body to the man, and each have authority over their own. What he's painting a picture of is a type of mutuality that would utterly confound most readers at this time. He's saying, not only, stay married, stay in that sexual relationship, but I want you to think of it with a mutuality you've never even considered before. And so then in verse 5, he says, don't deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. So this mutuality is what I want to unpack, because I think that there's a word for us today that is also, can be very challenging and helpful to us as we consider the relationship of marriage and the sexual relationship within it. You see, when Paul does this, he turns a lot of things on the ear culturally. You see, in an idea of mutuality in marriage, there can be no power plays, no manipulation, and certainly no form of abuse. So Paul is saying it's going to look different for believers to address the sexual relationship in marriage. And we want to hold it high, and it's going to have different standards. Then he goes on to say this verse that has really puzzled me a good bit in my contemplation, and that is about don't deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time to devote yourself to prayer. Okay, so maybe what he's addressing is that there are people out there whose sexual intimacy in their marriage is so preoccupying and so time-consuming that there's just really no time for prayer. And that could be it. And so I am just going to say, if that is you, then heed this word from Paul. Perhaps you should take a little time for prayer. Now, sometimes that makes me think, okay, spoken like a single guy. But anyway, we don't even know. Paul might have been married before, and people have wondered if maybe he was widowed. So I can't make that case for sure. But what if we look at that verse a little bit differently? What if the sexual relationship in marriage is so preoccupying because it's so painful? What if the brokenness and the arguments and the stuck conversations have gotten to a point where this couple is in such pain that it is very consuming? They're avoiding the potential of conversations, or are avoiding conversations about initiating sexual intimacy. In that case, Paul's word sounds different, does it not? What if you take some time, take the pressure off, and decide you're not going to engage in the sexual intimacy for a time so you can really pray about what's going on here? Why are we having so much difficulty in our sexual relationship? In the field, when you're treating couples, there's a shorthand for unequal sexual desire. There's the low desire partner, the LDP, and the high desire partner, the HDP. So there's often uneven desire for sexual experience, and that can be very, very extreme, or even just a little bit different. And what I think those prayer times might look like for the low desire partner as opposed to the high desire partner might be kind of different. For the low desire partner, the starting question might be, what is coming up that's causing me to be so unwilling to engage in the sexual part of my marriage? There might be a lot of, really individual work to do. I mean, there might be issues of abuse. There might be body image issues. There might be real issues because of family of origin, about being vulnerable. And some of those things might be wrapped into relationship issues, but they also might just need to be dealt with personally by that person. They fold into, a lot of times, though, other relationship issues too. Is there unforgiveness? Are there stuck fight patterns with a failure to repair afterwards? What's coming up that's making this so difficult? In the field also, we talk about different kinds of desire. There is spontaneous desire, and there is reactive desire. Now, this can be true about anything. Like, there can be spontaneous desire for a new car that some people just think, I would like a new car, out of the blue. Other people have to have their car die to have any desire for the car, right? The new car. It's reactive desire. This is the same in sexuality. Some people experience spontaneous desire. They walk around and they just suddenly become very aware of themselves as a sexual person with a lot of longing and wish for sexual union. But other people, in fact, about half of the population, they don't work like that. There has to be some kind of contact for desire to show up. It's reactive. It's not spontaneous. And I think that can shift depending on what's happening in your life. And I want to hear an amen to that. If you have little kids crawling all over you all day, you may not want to be touched in any way later. There may be no desire, but it's circumstantial. Or you might have so much pressure and stress at work and so many financial woes and struggles that you can't even think about it. And what may have been spontaneous desire before has kind of quieted. So these things shift and move according to kind of what life is like. But imagine what's going to happen in a relationship when the low desire partner who only really ever or circumstantially experience reactive desire is waiting for spontaneous desire to show up. It's probably not going to happen. The thing is, we've kind of been sold a bill of goods in the society that everyone has spontaneous desire. That's what every movie tells us. That's what all the ads on TV tell us. But it's just not true. So it could be more subtle to unpack. Now, the high desire partner, what could really praying intently about this part of their life be like? And it might be a little bit of a different starting point. Like, what's coming up that may make it difficult for my partner to want to have sexual relationship with me? Now, that could be a lot of things. I know that Dan and I have switched over the course of our relationship in being the high or the low desire partner. But when I came into marriage, I was so wrapped up in this idea that whether I was attractive sexually to Dan made me an okay and whole and complete person, that I was incredibly anxious about our sexual relationship. Any kind of way I would sense that he wasn't interested in me would send me into a bit of a crisis. So there can be anxiety and fear motivating high desire. And that's something that you can pray about and work on. And that was something that we actually went and spent a weekend with the pastor that married us to talk about this. And we had some really awkward conversations in that time. But we needed the help to look at it. And it was good for us. But there can be all kinds of relationship things that come up that the high desire partner might do well to look at. Is our relationship characterized by kindness and consideration? Am I responding well to emotional bids? Am I considerate and empathetic and connecting? And then, is there anything that my spouse has been asking me about that I have not been willing to adequately address? And what is that stubbornness coming from? You see, it can look all kinds of different ways. But that process of praying about it is something that I think that Paul alludes to as an important thing. Jesus wants us to work on these things so that we can have a right relationship within marriage. Now, I see in my practice a number of Orthodox Jewish couples, and I've learned so many fascinating things about their rhythm of life, but one of them is how sexual relationship unfolds within marriage. About half of the month, the couple is what we call allowed to each other, and that's when they have a sexual relationship, and then the other half of the month, they're not allowed to each other. And in this time, they abstain from sexual relating, and they don't touch at all or flirt or anything. Now, at the time of ending the time they're not allowed to each other, the woman will go to a ritual cleansing bath called the mikveh, and then the couple is expected they'll come back together sexually that evening. So they have this time of preparation to prepare themselves physically, emotionally, and spiritually that we're coming back together. If there are anything's blocking that, that's the day to work on it. That's the day to figure it out. So they have kind of an external pattern that puts a bit of an invitation on the couple to deal with stuff. In our marriages, we don't have that much of that. We don't have anything external. Most of the pressure comes from within and can be felt as a really stuck, painful, rejecting fight dynamic that happens again and again, and where no one is expected to kind of work on themselves and figure out what's going on. So I've become really passionate about marriage issues becoming something we talk about more with each other, but also in the community. See, I feel like we're too often like this about sexual relationship and marriage. We're not even really talking about it. And so it'd be so much better to turn around and start a conversation with our spouses. But this can wind up being a hard dynamic too, where we see each other on opposite sides of the problem, where the other person is really to blame. Here's what I suggest. We sit on the same side of the table, and we're looking at the problem, which is here. Hey, we have an issue, a block in our sexual relationship. We have uneven sexual desire. What are we going to do about our shared problem? And looking at it together. This could be just like you're looking at, what are we going to do about the fact that you like to go to the mountains on vacation and I like to go to the beach? Or what are we going to do about the fact that you prefer private schools for our kids and I prefer public? You sit on the same side of the table and you look at it as our shared problem. What do? You don't have to approach it as enemies, but to look at it together and consider the other person's needs and concern as equal to your own. That's mutuality. And that's what I think we're being invited to. So how can we start these conversations? I think some of you today, this afternoon, get on the same side of the table, literally get on the same side of a table and try to have a conversation about this and see where it goes. I've been trying to figure out how can we normalize these problems and bring them into dialogue that is doable and havable in marriage relationships. And that's where this idea of doing the ongoing marriage workshops and the Saturday date night for me have come, is that I'm really passionate about people seeing, my problems in relationship are really not that unusual. We can have language to talk about them, and we can talk to other people about them. So you guys, on the 23rd, we're having a Saturday date night, and I hope that every couple out there will consider coming, because it'll be a place where we're trying to open up some of these conversations, but in a non-threatening way. If you came last year, the content is going to be completely different this year, so I hope you'll come. And I hope you'll come away with some really clear, practical things you can do to really impact your marriage. Now, we're intentionally making this event non-threatening so that you can invite your friends. It should be a place where people who've never set foot in a church should feel very comfortable. And I hope that you'll do that, because what we hope to do there is inspire different dialogue, to see that there's something new that can happen in our marriages, and not just to give up. That's what I see all too often. People have just given up. And around the sexual relationship, yeah, very often, an absolute inability to talk about it and just the willingness to let it die. So let's do something different in our relationships. But not only that, let's be on a mission together to help the flourishing of our friends and neighbors, to move into a better way of being married and a better way of relating.